Welcome everyone to Building Blocks. It is so good to have you in the midst of this crazy time. And so many of people in Elmhurst are aware of the possibility of us doing and bringing change because sometimes we just lack an empowering and loving community. And so we realize that when people are not empowered, then the community doesn't thrive. And that's why we exist. And so City Mission is a nonprofit in Elmhurst working to create that thriving neighborhood by working with youth, mainly, and things that concern immigrants and those experiencing homelessness. And so what you're at right now today, Building Blocks, is the teaching arm of City Mission, where we bring in people from all over New York City to come in and share their experiences, what they're doing with any one of those three groups, and how they are bringing change and creating thriving communities where they're at. We've had people from NYC Relief, from a lot of people doing work with people experiencing homelessness in Manhattan and elsewhere. We've had Chandra Waworuntu, who may or may not be here. She works against human trafficking that is rife in Elmhurst and many other places, and all across the 74th area, the 7 train, all under the 7 train. It's the hot spot of human trafficking, unfortunately, and potentially for the nation. And so we've had her, but that was before Corona. And so now why we're doing this is, in case you're wondering, like, how do we do things in this intense season where things just don't make sense? But good news, we have a lot of great news. One of them is that City Mission, us, together with the Elm Church, has raised $23,498. Like, let's give ourselves a round of applause. Like, that's insane. Thank you for all of you that have donated and all of you that have shared on Facebook and elsewhere. This is the largest donation that Elmhurst Hospital has received thus far. And we've been talking with the CFO, David Guzman, on how to allocate those funds. And so we're going to be purchasing N95 masks, and hopefully those will be arriving soon because, as you know, Elmhurst Hospital is all over the news. But on top of that, Elmhurst is not sitting back and doing nothing. We have amazing people like Pastor Joe of St. Jacobus, Flora Ministries, and many others from the neighborhood that have helped out and packed food and handed food out together, including people like Red, including people like Tim Wijaya, Craig, Tony Suigno, and many others from our own neighborhood. So do not lose hope. Things are going well. Food pantries are alive, and there are many that are hungry and need it. And so this has been an incredible time where people have been stepping up and making a difference. So thank you to all of you. And on top of that, the last thing is today we have one such guest that is always doing incredible things wherever he lives. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Chris Kleiman, who is a man who loves New York City with all his heart, and especially the people in it, from Mali to Argentina to Indonesia, so much that he wrote a book cataloging 82 different groups in New York City. And I don't know if that's a crazy feat, but that's insane. And now the question might be for all of us, Christians and non-Christians, like, with the lockdown and COVID-19 in the way of us meeting our neighbors, how do we manage to build our relationships with them? And so Chris Kleiman is the co-founder and associate director of Global Gates, which is a missions organization trying to reaching people and their nations by using global cities that will eventually lead them back to their home countries or their own neighborhoods where they are. And he's also the author of 2 books that you can find on Amazon: Super Plan, A Journey into God's Story, and Ethnicity, The Nations, Tongues, and Faiths of Metropolitan New York. And we'll drop the links in the chat box below. And so now, Chris, is your time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Sure, great to be here. I am on day 17 of having the coronavirus, and so I've been in bed most of the last 2 weeks, feeling a little bit better today. So I apologize if I don't have as much energy as normal. I know all of you know people who've been infected or have been infected yourselves. I heard just in the last couple of days, 80% of the kids in the city have been infected. Most likely, but are asymptomatic. So it's been an interesting time for sure. I'm going to kind of flow through here. There are many different ways of looking at the city. Most of you probably in this call are in the city or been here, if not your whole life, a lot of your life. And as you know, there are many different ways of looking at the city. Even ministries will have a certain focus in the city as well. all of us are trying to survive. And so you kind of have to focus in somewhere. And that's actually a healthy, good thing. You need a healthy ecosystem in the city to effectively reach it. My niche has been primarily with the unreached people groups of Metro New York and in kind of Western gateway cities. I and my wife did not plan on staying in New York. Actually came here via Mali, West Africa, the whole mud hut, no electricity, no running water situation among an ethnic group where we knew of zero Christians. And that was, I don't know, 20 years ago that I was there, but was medevaced twice, had about 3.5 years of debilitating illness, came close to dying, all of that. And that's part of what God used to bring us to New York. And so we came here, and the very first West African man we meet is from the same ethnic group I used to live among, which was a previously unengaged unreached people group. No missionaries even trying to reach them, no Christians among them, no church, obviously. And so the very first West African man we meet in New York is from that group, and it turns out he's a Christian from a Muslim background, the first one we'd ever heard of. And so long story short, we end up meeting a bunch of people from that ethnic group in the Bronx that night, move here 3 months later, and we've been in the city for 14 years now. So we have 3 kids. They've all been raised in Harlem in the South Bronx. But as I started working with West Africans, I started researching the ethnic groups of New York and just realized that there's a lot that is here in this city, even on a global scale, for frontier missions. Your pioneering missions used to be, let's all go to the villages way far away, exotic Indiana Jones adventures. And these days, because of everything that's happening, our cities are very strategic. And so one mobilization project we did was this book, and really realized without research, people are not aware. And without being aware, people do not feel responsible. And it was one tool among many others that we've been trying to get out, and others have as well, of really, if you're not aware of the strategic nature of some of these neighbors that are there in Elmhurst or wherever, you don't really feel a sense of responsibility. So that's something we've tried to do. In Acts, it says, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. He's actually not far from each one of us. If you look at that verse, one of the very pertinent parts of that for our situation here in New York with the diversity of immigrants is this: God allotted the periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. So it doesn't matter what your political views are that you have, God in some way is behind the migration, the movement of peoples around the world for a purpose, that they might find him. And historically, I mean, even at the book of Acts, the gospel was spread through the movement of peoples throughout the Roman roads. These days, those Roman roads are migration, and it's technology. And so the gospel is being spread in really multiplicative forms in the last 20, 30 years because of what's been happening with migration and technology. Here's Metro New York itself. There are 23 million-ish people in Metro New York, the tri-state area. When I started looking into the peoples of New York, I was shocked with the numbers. And you got to keep in mind, 14 years ago, I could count on one hand the people that were reaching out to the least reached peoples of Metro New York, if you don't count Jewish work, because they were well established. But beyond that, I could count on one hand the people that really just saw the need and began reaching out to them. Others were either from the culture themselves, that maybe they were Muslim, came to faith in Christ, or reaching out to their people, or were missionaries overseas, came back like me because of health reasons, and were here. It has really changed what the Lord has done in the last 10 years to raise up laborers in the city from churches, organizations, and so forth. But just in Metro New York, we're talking about 2 million Jews. If you count New York City, the cities proper, Tel Aviv proper, I think is 250,000. people. And so New York City proper has the largest Jewish population in the world, at least for a city. And then metro area, of course, it would be Tel Aviv. And those are very diverse. It's not just your Eastern European, Ashkenazi, Fiddler on the Roof variety. It's Syrian Jews. There's an Afghan Jewish synagogue in Flushing. They're Jews from Afghanistan. There are Yemeni Jews. There are Bukharan Jews. The largest Jewish population in the world from Uzbekistan are in the Forest Hills, Rego Park area. So the diversity is off the charts, and many of those are very unengaged, not to count all the Hasidic Jewish groups like Satmar, who are anti-Israel and have their own dialect of Yiddish spoken in Williamsburg. So the diversity is pretty extreme. With Muslims, they're around 1 million, and of course there are lots of Arabs, but there are actually more Arab Christians in America than Arab Muslims. You really see large numbers with the South Asian population that you would see very close to Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, which is their major commercial center in the city. Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, but even within that, there's diversities of those. So there's the Sylheti population that are in Astoria from Bangladesh. There are 100,000 or so West African Muslims. We're counting 70-something West African mosques just in New York City. So that's diverse. Around 500,000 Hindus, and you always think India, and that is certainly the case. There are a lot of Indian Christians, a lot of Sikhs and others here as well, 80,000 Sikhs. But there are also a lot of Hindus from Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, and Richmond Hill. And Buddhists are very hard to determine because of Chinese popular religion mixes elements of a lot of things, Buddhism, Taoism. So very rough estimate of 300,000. So one of the things I started realizing is that our immigrants are rekindling religious fervor in North American cities. We always have this idea. I grew up in the kind of suburbs in Texas, and we had this view of New York City as it's Babylon. This is a pagan area. It's where everything that is vile and evil comes from. That's often the view people have of New York City. And reality is, because of migration and because of a general disposition that's beginning to change and people are becoming more spiritual, we're seeing a rekindling of religious fervor in our cities. So much so that we used to think of us being involved in a post-Christian environment. And people are beginning to see that we're actually entering into a post-secular existence. Now, certainly not coming as much from the government or media, although it is changing slightly, but on the ground and everyday New York City neighborhoods, you're talking about very religious places. So Tony Carnes is a guy who studied religion in New York City for many years. You can check out nycreligion.info to show you how skewed people's thoughts are on even Christian presence in the city. The biggest religious census in America is the Association of Religion Data Archives. They were counting around 357,000 evangelicals in New York City proper. Tony, through his research, is counting 1.3 to 1.8 million. That's a huge, huge difference. Part of the reason why the ARDA numbers skewed is they don't count traditional African-American congregations or Hispanic churches or immigrant churches, which is a bulk of our city. So even the largest, I think Christian Culture Center is the largest church or one of the top 2 or 3 largest churches in the city. They would not even be counted in the ARDA figures. And so ARDA would count around 1,400 evangelical churches. We're now counting over 8,000. Well, that means that in everyday New York City life, the church has a significant role to play on the ground. And it's not just Christians. Obviously, all those Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, Hindus play a huge factor as well. Migration, technological developments, urbanization. The world is becoming quickly urban, 60, maybe 60 to 70% over the next 20 years. It's already half urban. Transnationalism. These have fostered a new era in pioneer missions in which work by, with, and through the diaspora can be very strategic. Now, that word diaspora, it was used for the Jews that were spreading throughout the known world, and is commonly used today in missions just to refer to anyone who has left their homeland. Diaspora means scattered. And so working by the diaspora, them being the primary agents that are working, or with them, alongside them, or through them to reach different areas of the world, are becoming very strategic. Look at this quote from Edward Judson. He was a son of Adoniram. Adoniram was the first kind of traditional missionary from America. He went to what was called Burma, or what we often think of as Burma. And he said in 1914, he was pastoring a church in New York City. He said, "Indeed, I am often thrilled by the thought that the long, healing shadow of my father's life touches city missions and falls upon the foreigners that come in such vast throngs from the ends of the earth to settle in our great cities. We used to think of them as a menace, but have learned to regard them as an opportunity. It would seem as if our Heavenly Father, perceiving that we Christians of America were so vitally interested in foreign races so as to send our best men and women to them with the gospel, paying their travel expenses and maintenance, deemed it wise to put in the hearts of the heathen to come from all parts of the world to our shores, paying their own expenses." That was 100 years ago. Now, what's interesting about that is that migration or immigration was not all that diverse in 1914. The world has changed tremendously since then. Because of the diversity visa in 1965 and family reunification visas that would follow those, immigrants are now from the least reached areas of the world. I've known missionaries in Yemen, one of the most Muslim countries in the world. Everyone I knew that was there either lost their platform to stay in the country as evangelist and missionary, or they were killed. And yet you can go to basically any bodega in many neighborhoods in New York City, and by buying a hero, you can have access to Yemen. They've actually taken over bodegas, a Spanish word, in the city. And these transnational relationships are so much more natural today. I mean, even when I lived in Africa, there was no Skype or anything like that. These days, through WhatsApp and WeChat and everything else, people are talking even to that small little small hut, no electricity, no running water village. You know, they've got cell phones now, and so the world has become connected. And I used to see all these West African Muslim guys on the phone all day long. I'm like, who are they talking to? Almost all the time, they were talking, even shaping society back home from their little street vending stand. So in Acts 1:8, Jesus says, "You'll be my witnesses from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth." We often think of that as just a geographical thing. There was a sense where that was happening. But also, when you talk to a first century Jew about being a witness in Samaria, you were talking about going to your enemies. And the reality is, when it says the ends of the earth, people were thinking that's way beyond anything they've ever experienced. Today, the ends of the earth have been made near because of migration and technology. What will it take to reach the least reach? I'm going to have to go through this quick. One is we have to raise the missions climate in our cities. Urban churches are inclined to cope and minister to the proximate struggles around them. Everyone's in survival mode. There are usually two types of ministry in the city. Traditionally, it's those that are the influencers and those who are the down and out. A lot of your immigrants fit into both of those categories, but not into the paradigm of the ministries reaching out. They're usually having the worst jobs here, being first generation immigrants. There's obviously some, that's a generalization. And they are very influential back home, often the movers and shakers back home. I realized this real quick when I had a car washer friend from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. They leave that job and work another job from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And when I went back to stay in his home in Mali, He had the largest home in the neighborhood. The Secretary General of the largest political party in Mali picked me up at the airport, his contact. He owned the largest craft business in the major craft area and market of this capital city. He had several other buildings he rented out for income. He had 2 wives, status, one on the first floor, one on the second floor, one had a Mercedes. That was my car washer friend. And so often the immigrants, they don't fit into those categories of the down and out or the influencers, or really both at the same time. Churches can also, especially in the first generation, but also otherwise, can become cultural fortresses whose function is more survival than mission. So one of the things we have to do is have more missions education classes just to make people aware. Perspectives classes, there's a new one called Momentum Yes, that's free. We're beginning, actually, I think New Life is beginning to experiment with. We need to mobilize people. That means to get them active and engagement with some of these least reached peoples. There are 3 types of laborers in general that we can mobilize. One are people that are going to have to, because there aren't same culture Christians among these least reached groups, that has to come in from the outside. So cross-cultural evangelist without language and culture immersion. They don't know the language of the people. They're not familiar with the culture, but they've got a friend, they've got a coworker, and they begin reaching out to them. These have the largest numbers available. We saw all those Christians in the city, the opportunities that they have to interact. So we have to have large numbers interacting through work, play, their neighborhood with these groups. They are the least effective because they don't have the language and culture immersion, but still play a vital role. So one of the things we've done is started a Heart for Muslims conference a few years ago to really just kind of raise up that vision and tools and heart for reaching Muslim immigrants in the city. Things like that need to increase. There's another type of labor. These are cross-cultural evangelists with language and culture skills. I would fit into this category. I speak a language called Bambara. I speak a language called Bambara. I speak it like a child of Africa, as they say. That allowed to be more on the end. These peoples that are here and work through their existing networks. Still, it might be a little more fruitful than the ones without language culture skills, but we're not seeing most fruit from either of these 2 categories. But this category becomes essential for finding and working alongside and helping train even the 3rd category. We started an organization called Global Gates to help raise up probably well, all of our cross-cultural missionaries would fit into this category, but we also have same culture missionaries as well. This is where we see the fruit happening really throughout the world and with unreached peoples. And these are same or near culture Christians. Now, the problem with unreached people groups is Christians don't exist. And are there near culture Christians to them? So when we think about mobilization, we're often thinking about our church or my friends or people like me. The more strategic thing to do is, okay, what are the groups that are closest in culture to these unreached peoples? What can I do to help stir vision? So we've done things like Perspectivas classes, a missions class in Spanish and in Queens even. I remember this one Colombian pastor getting up and yelling at me during one of the sessions going, "Why am I just now hearing this? Why am I just now hearing this?" I had no idea the disparity of where missionaries are going and how we need to send more Muslims or more missionaries to the Muslim world. And we're seeing that Hispanics are becoming a lot more, Muslims accept them more. There's a lot more ease and bridging into the cultures, even the way it's structured and the importance of family. There's not a lot of the political baggage maybe that a white American would have trying to go to some place that was colonized by white Europeans and so forth. There are also connections like the largest concentration of Tibetans outside of China, India, and Nepal is in your area, Jackson Heights and Elmhurst. And so the first Tibetans we saw come to Christ in the city were through Indians, because a lot of Tibetans have come through India or Nepal that are to here and settle into Indian or Nepalese neighborhoods, Nepali neighborhoods. immigrant Christians need to change their narrative. So one of my African colleagues, he has a church in the city. It has more Muslim background Christians in it than any other city or church in New York. Probably around 100 Muslim background Christians now that are connected to that church. He is not from the same culture of the main Muslim groups, but he's close enough to where it can work and it fits, and there's kind of a lingua franca that they can use in French. But also because at the very beginning, he says, I'm not going to be about the American dream. We're not about the American dream. We are here as part of God's redemptive story. And so immigrants need to see their narrative of being here as part of a larger story, not just I'm here for a better life, more economic opportunity, education, or what it might be. Some of what it's going to have to take with mobilization. Thankfully, a lot of missionaries, especially in New York City, were starting to think through how do you take people that work 60 to 80 hours a week and they're always on their phones and their commutes and effectively communicate the gospel. Well, evangelism and discipleship has to fit into the stream of how people are communicating, and people are communicating through social media. And so we've done a lot to try to get up to speed with having Facebook pages and websites for Muslims and things like that. And it's a time and cost-effective funnel to sow the seeds of the gospel and find people God is already working on. So this is an example from our West African work this last month. We spent just $356, highly targeted Jesus film ads in African Muslim languages. So very kind of niche group. 555,000 people had the opportunity to see the video. 33,000 people watched a complete video. 43,000 people clicked on our evangelistic website for Muslims, and 2,700 people shared our post with others. And that led to dozens and dozens of conversations. So you're talking about coronavirus, what can you do? Well, everyone's on social media. And you can find either through existing workers, like I need people who speak French right now to help dialogue, but even with Google Translate with some of these languages, there's a good enough where you can still function to interact through those. We've got a huge Bengali focus right now, and I think there have been over 100 Bengalis who have died from the coronavirus in New York City. And just throwing out ads, how can we pray for you? And people would have Bengali Muslim background Christians that would pray for people. And I think they just received a note yesterday that someone in New York City was ready to be baptized just through social media efforts and just being the church and seeking to love and find ways to connect. If you're not connected locally with some people that have some language skills, we can help connect you. But the other thing you can do, there's something called Embassy Project. It's through Crescent Project. You can go to crescentproject.org/embassy, and they will actually help train you and connect you with using English chat groups around the world that you can connect with least reach peoples around the world through italki and some other things. But they'll go and kind of guide you through that. Use social media to connect with people. And this is very relevant for us today. We have to deploy missionaries in response to social stirrings. Most people switch religions due to some sort of dissonance in their life. They're disenchanted with Islam. They're disenchanted with wars going on in their home country. They are struggling because of some calamity in their life. Think coronavirus. And people become hungry in ways that they haven't, more spiritually interested, not as closed off. So I had a Muslim guy in my home about a month ago before I got the virus. And he says, you don't seek food unless you are hungry. You don't want water until you are thirsty. He says, I've come today because I am hungry and I am thirsty. And I want to hear from God's word. And I want to pray for God's intervention with this. And he's been leaving me these 3-minute messages talking stories he's heard from God's word from me and praying for God's intervention. And so a lot of people are seeing this event as in times, especially Muslims will have that mindset, or they're just searching for answers they're struggling, and just being available to people. This is unlike 9/11 when it brought people together. This is socially distancing people, and people are longing for that social connection more than ever. So even I've heard of in Astoria and Queens and various places that people are all home. When do you have everyone home in New York City? And some at least are going out in their front yards or on their balconies, and it's ways that you can connect with people even from a distance, but not socially. You can connect with people because they're ready to hear some sort of hope or just a prayer. You don't have to come with a well-polished evangelistic presentation. You just need to be available and pray and respond to the stirring within people. Most immigrants are responsive within the first year or two of some big stirring that's taken place. I'm going to go through just a few more slides here, then we'll have some question and answer. Uh, One example, though, the Russian Jews came here as blank slates because of communism, and there's one pastor that baptized 650 Jews in 6 years. Then afterwards, there wasn't as much of a response. We need to cooperate and pray together more. In pioneering mission efforts, there's much more cooperation and partnership between missionaries and churches. Having a kingdom focus and finding ways to partner and pray in ministry are key. This is a key thing during coronavirus, is focused prayer groups for those that are affected are taking place a lot now. Churches need to move beyond our own structures and programs. We often desire to be multi-ethnic. It's actually hard not to be multi-ethnic if it's not a first-generation church in New York. But because it's multi-ethnic, it almost inoculates the church about the thought that, are we actually reaching lost people? The reality is maybe all of these people were Assembly of God in their own country and they came together into an Assembly of God church. Or just because you have an Indian or a Bengali church doesn't mean that it's reaching lost people. It could really just be a cultural fortress, a way that you retain your culture, and they might not be interested at all at reaching the majority of people from their country who are Hindu or Muslim or whatever. And so we need to still not just be satisfied with having multiple ethnic groups, but getting out there. Missional communities are a step in the right direction, but even that, we need to think about these middle groups where you're at least crossing to the culture of the unreached ethnic group. Unreached groups don't want to set foot in existing churches or groups that are very distant in culture. I had a Muslim guy say, explain this to me. He says, I see that these churches, it doesn't seem like religion to me. The women, they are going in there, they do not wear the many clothes, they dance, they sing. This is discotheque. This is not religion. For him, the church, the existing church, as he saw it, was a barrier. If you have people that will begin changing their culture a little bit, maybe they're sitting on the floor and having Arab snacks, for instance, in your small group, and allowing Muslims and others to come in and just investigate Christian community, that will help us get past the barriers. We need kingdom businesses and kingdom-minded professionals. One of the things Muslims are very clear about is you can recognize a Muslim store. They're raising funds for the mosque. They're saying, we're halal or whatever. It's very hard to identify Christian businesses. I've had immigrant Christians point this out to me. Like, what are our Christian businesses? I thought America was a Christian country, and here we are. There's no Christian businesses and Muslim businesses everywhere. But I hear these stories of maybe a hair salon owner who begins opening up her doors after hours and starting Bible study with some of the clients and coworkers, or hosting a prayer meeting there, or allowing missionaries to use their space, for Bible studies. Also hiring bivocational missionaries and giving them some flexibility. There's one person who works in a deli, or at least has in the past, is one of the more effective missionaries among Muslims in the city. She has won many Muslims to Christ just through her deli in Queens. This also helps us for accessing closed people groups. Groups like the Hasidic Jews, they're probably not going to be accessed by you going into their neighborhood and just holding a street preaching campaign. It's probably going to be happening through business people at what is that, B&H Photo Video, or the diamond industry, or the rugs, or whatever it might be. Business people are going to be very strategic for reaching some groups. We need to have an intentionality of reaching specific peoples. Unless there's some social movement that's made a particular group inclined to leave the religion and join another, like the Islamic Revolution and Persians, it takes a focused effort to reach unreached peoples. You can't just set up church. In fact, one of the most influential churches in our city, one of the founders told me once, said, we just thought we'd start this church and it would trickle down and reach all the peoples of the city. And we're realizing decades later, we haven't touched unreached peoples. It does take a focused effort. And the goal is not to divide people from one another. Instead, you have to do that to reach an entire city and build the kingdom of God. We have to live as foreign missionaries within a native setting. We used to think about missionaries to the foreign world. And in some ways, it's easier to be a missionary overseas because it's natural to give up the comforts and adapt to a different culture, which corresponds with effectiveness. Not so in the US. So Christian workers need to have feet in two worlds and become citizens of the diaspora. Treat being here in an effective mission work as we've really left America. We're becoming citizens of the diaspora. So there's a couple, that was one of our apartments in Harlem. We held a baby naming ceremony. Over 50 people, Muslims mainly, came into our home that night to have really a traditional Muslim form, and we baptized it and had a Christian Muslim background person as our imam who performed the ceremony. We shared why we named our daughter after a missionary. It was a great event, so much so they were passing out DVDs of it afterwards in their Muslim stores to show people and really spread the word. So we have to do things like that to enter into their world. And collaborate with mission efforts in people's homelands, partly to be aware of Christians and seekers migrating to America. For instance, there have been movements of Bangladeshis who come to Christ in Bangladesh. If you're connected with that and they move into your city, you have some effective workers. In fact, the first purely Muslim background Christian church in New York City was started in the last 2 years in Queens by a missionary we're associated with. And he was a Muslim background Christian already, and he was ready to work. He was ready to share with his people. But also to follow through the doors opened by people here to their homeland. And so the same group I used to live among, the Wasalu, we saw the first churches started among them by working through these relational lines back to their homeland and seeing that first church started there. The diaspora already connected to the world. It's a very natural way, as opposed to going over and doing some project which involves some sort of influx of money and development projects and the relationship being skewed. Diaspora already connected to the world. It's a natural way of sharing. They can be incredible portals and gateways for spreading the gospel to the world. It's a very natural way to do it, and sometimes the most strategic way to spread the gospel to different nations and peoples. What can you do? Besides some of the things I already mentioned related to coronavirus, you might have your own ideas as well. We have people that are buying masks, sanitizer for Muslim store owners in Queens, just offering to pray for them. Be human, just ask the Lord how you might be able to effectively just show Christ's love to your neighbors. What is just befriending people, Muslims and other immigrants locally. Use your professional skills and experience to help missionaries in the city. Some of the best partnerships we've had are those that said, hey, I can give some marketing skills or some web development skills, graphic design. Incorporate prayer for the least reached people groups of Metro New York into prayer and life groups. We've got some great things, research that we can pass your way. Learn about Muslims and unreached people groups through websites and books. See globalgates.info/UPG for infographics and things we've created. Peoplegroups.info, you can actually do like a virtual prayer walk. We have several hundred mosques, for instance, on that website where you can check out where those are. Unreachednewyork.com has some of my research on peoples of New York, as well as a rotating people group of the day that you can pray for and put on your phone. Join existing ministry work in the city among least reached peoples through evangelism, teaching English, etc. There are lots of people that would love to train you, work alongside you, help you connect with people you're already naturally connected with. And there's some information for different websites that would be of interest. And Fiel, I believe you had some questions to start off with.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Fiel, you said you wanted to have a little time of question and answer.
Yes. So I guess I'm assuming that's the end of your presentation.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Before we do that, why don't we take a moment and well, first of all, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing what you're doing through Power of Christ and also through Global Gates and all the things that you're doing, especially because you are still recovering from Corona, right? That's insane. So I know everyone's mics are mute, but let's give Chris a round of applause for being with us today. Despite that's going to be a story for all of us as we go forward. Remember that one time that there's that Chris guy and he was preaching throughout all this, sharing with us. Yeah. So I'm going to be able to share that with people when I'm older. So very quickly, why don't we take like a 1-minute stretch break? And for those of you that don't know about City Mission or Global Gates on the other end, why don't you find us on Instagram and Facebook at City Mission NYC. I'm going to drop that right there. So go follow us there. And also, of course, Global Gates on Facebook. As per the recording, Daniel Su will set everything up afterwards so that you can have access to that if you weren't able to make all of it. And so let's take 1 minute to just stand up and whatever, because, presentations are long. We're on Zoom all day. Everyone knows that it is tough being at a desk. And so go ahead and find City Mission NYC or Global Gates. And I'm hoping to set up an email after this where I'll get all the links that were mentioned, and there'll be if this were a podcast, I would say in the show notes, but we'll send you an email with all the information of all the links that Chris was sharing, and as well.
I'll just drop them in the chat there too.
Yeah, you can do that too. Yeah, perfect. So, man, I hope they give you guys stretch breaks when you're at work or doing whatever you're doing, because it's not easy staring at a screen all day. All right, so we are back, and so now is the fun part. I want to do like a moderated discussion. So I'll have a few questions for Chris, but then after that, we're going to do a Q&R, which is a question and response. And the reason we say question and response is because sometimes we don't have answers. All the best we can do is a response, and that's okay. And so we'll do that just after this. So I want to start off, Chris. It is uncanny because for those of you that don't know, I haven't seen Chris for 15 years until today. And the last time I saw him was when his son was 1 year old, and his son is now 16. And that just weirds me out. And he's been a friend of my dad's through the Metro New York Baptist Association, amongst other things. And so it's an absolute joy to have you here. But also for one that is, for many of us, we're like, what is it for you? Because you come from Texas originally, right? Like, why do you love New York City so much? Why didn't you stay in Mali or Texas, or like what brought you here?
Oh man. Well, my other book was Super Plan, A Journey into God's Story. And part of that is my story, as well as the stories of 3 Muslim background Christian people here in New York, and how our lives intertwine. But it started with a question I started changing in college. I was a good Christian, everyone's account around. But the question I was asking with my life was, what do Christians around me expect of me? What am I supposed to do? What does the church expect me to do? What does it mean, to be a good Christian? What am I supposed to do to meet expectations? I wasn't answering the question, what does God desire for me? And I changed that question to, what does God want? Even if people around me, Christians around me, think I'm crazy or don't agree or whatever. And that really set me on a series of adventures, studying in England, meeting Japanese friends. Most the Japanese friends had never met a Christian where they're from. So I don't know much about being a missionary, but I can go be the one Christian someone knows. So I started this kind of theme of wanting to be the one Christian someone knows. That led to this people group in Mali, West Africa, where there were no known Christians, and getting medevac and all of that. But part of the super plan that comes from this guy in Queens who started the Muslim background Christian church, Russell. He says, all these things should have happened, but God had a super plan. And American Christians often invite Jesus into our lives, and we limit Jesus's involvement as a result to our lives. There's nothing wrong with having Jesus in your life, except we say, here are my strengths, here are my weaknesses. I want you to come and use my gifts, right? But God often uses our weaknesses for his story and his plan. We have to give him those as well. We often say, here's where I live, come into my work and my neighborhood. And God sometimes wants to take you away from that work or neighborhood as part of his story. And so the whole book is really written in a way to invite people as well to not live for their own story, to live for God's story. Here's where those crises often take place, and you've got to make a decision one way or the other. And I give examples of those in our own lives. But that's really what started for me, is seeking not just to invite him into my life, but to live for his story, even if that meant I was going to die, even if that would mean this. And New York, plan was just to get a little healthier and go back to West Africa. But then I saw the story of what God was doing, of bringing the nations to here, of actually using the nations from here to actually see the first gospel advances in some of the least reached areas of the world through relational contacts from here. And through all those experiences and the research and what I was doing in West Africa from here, and some of the work and lives of other people in the city, we started Global Gates to even help address that. And what better place than New York to be based to reach the least reached areas of the world in and through cities.
I think that's just incredible. And I love how, as you started sharing the story of the super plan, you started smiling even more. Is this Russell Abraham you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That's funny. Wow. So I'm dropping the link to his book website down there in the chat box, so you guys can check it out. The Super Plan. I think it has a great message for those of us that need to understand that it's not about ourselves and it just, like, use me the way I want. It's rather, here I am. You're presenting yourself completely.
Yeah, otherwise we start with who we are instead of not what God wants to make of you. It's very different.
Yeah, and life is actually not about who we are necessarily. It's about who we are becoming, who God is making us to be, who he created us to be. And so that's so beautiful. Now, going with that, I'm curious, as and I'm sure many people are, it's like, how the heck do you get people on board with you on this? Like, how did you drag your wife, first of all, to Cambridge, right? And then to Mali, amongst other things. How does that work?
Yeah, I originally met my wife at a missions conference in Georgia. I was a speaking or a mission rep there, and she was coordinating it and heading to West Africa as a missionary. So that's where we originally met. Of course, that was after I got sick in Mali. We weren't in Mali together. And so we had to wrestle with, I can't promise West Africa because of my health issues. And one of the things my wife said is, look, we have callings to people and places at various times in our life. And God gives those callings. But sometimes when we can elevate that calling above God's direction, and we always have to hold our callings to particular people and places lightly, because the calling is to the journey with the Lord, and that's relational. And he's called me to take this journey, with you, even if that means not West Africa. And so I always remembered those words. I'm not sure if I'm saying it exactly, but the calling, even if you feel passionate about New York or this people group, you always have to have a calling to Jesus above all those things. So that means you're willing to allow him to take those away and give you new callings, as I've certainly had and experienced in my life.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. So about the last time that I saw you and when you disappeared off the face of the planet because you were so busy was when you were writing the book Ethnicity. For those of you that are asking, yes, you'll be able to ask questions in a few minutes. Just gonna, like I said, do moderated and then I'll do the Q&R. So you wrote this book Ethnicity, which is you cataloging and with what's her name, Meredith Lee, cataloging 82 different ethnic groups throughout New York City. So like, what was it like for you and what were some of the favorite stories that came from that? And I'll drop the link to that book also in the chat box below.
Sure. Yeah, that was actually 4 years of research and over 100 people helping me research, photograph the city, and so forth. And some of the greatest stories, research was never an end in itself. It was that initial kind of catalyst to create awareness and a sense of responsibility in the wider church. And so my favorite stories are an Indian prayer group in Queens calling me saying that they had the Spirit just poured over them and they were weeping, praying for the Hasidic Jews that they had been so prejudiced against and just passed by without having God's heart for them. Or a Ghanaian church. And I always get a little worried when someone from the ethnic group is reading the profile about them and what are they going to say? Because I try to be pretty objective about the situation. And I said, Ghanaians, their churches are prolific throughout the city, some of those vibrant church services you would ever go to, but they are so ethnocentric in their in who they are not reaching beyond their ethnic group to see that they are the closest bridge to West African Muslims and other groups in the city. Yeah. Well, so they read that and they just felt very convicted. He said, it's true. We are so focused on being Ghanaian that we're not seeing this larger story we can be a part of. So they began praying through a profile of ethnicity every church service on Sunday mornings, just because they realized something about themselves, through that. So those are the cool stories, is when you see the effect of it just giving enough information where that person who sits next to you in the subway, whereas in the past it was so foreign you couldn't even start anything. Right. Now it's enough where you can start a conversation, and the photos and everything, it brings the humanity of the city, into like, kind of like this was preceded Humans of New York, but it's the same thing there, where it humanizes the diversity of the city, whereas it's so overwhelming in the beginning, you just have to shut off all those senses to survive. Now you know enough information to begin having God's heart for them and start conversations and pray and so forth.
Yeah, for those of you that have never seen the book, it is an incredible work, and I, as a nerd of cultures and languages and things like that, I just love that. First of all, you can see where they live, which neighborhoods they live in the Metro New York area, how many of them there are, what languages they actually speak, how the heck did they come here, like what brought them here, who they're related to. Like you have groups like Korean Chinese. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that group, but there's Koreans that immigrated to China over 100 years ago, and they, for some reason, made it out here. Or you have Guatemalans, or you have Chinese Malaysians, and then so Chris cataloged all these different groups, including French Canadians or French people, and and he just lays it all out, and it's just so beautiful when you can actually see the people on the subway, as Chris was mentioning, and say, "Oh, I know a little bit about you. I'd like to get to know you a bit more." And when you realize that like Jewish isn't like one thing, there's so many different types. I had no idea how diverse they were until I read his book. Like he mentioned earlier, I was about to say in the show earlier in this talk, that there's Jews that hate Israel, there's others that are very pro, and so you never really. It's just unfair for us as New Yorkers who live in the city of the world to be stuck in our own country, in our neighborhoods.
That awareness can have huge effects. I mean, we actually had a missionary with us for a while, grew up in a neighborhood in New York, and she said, I never noticed these Muslims that were prolific in her neighborhood. And she kind of saw the research and everything and just started seeing New York City in a new light, became a missionary among those people. Or I heard recently about a person in Mississippi that got a hold of ethnicity somehow, and for the first time started hearing about these Hasidic Jewish groups. I had no idea, but she, over the last few years, had become the main prayer coordinator worldwide, for Hasidic Jews. And you see that if we can just spread this vision and get stuff out there, it's part of a super plan. It's not something you control or take. It's just info that you get out, and that will help others be a part of the same story.
Yeah, that's great. So one last question before I open the floor up to everyone else, and you can do video or else just voice. But so for many of us, you're maybe wondering, like, maybe you're just a kid out of college in Elmhurst, and you're of Chinese descent, and you've always gone to a Chinese church or whatever ethnic church, and you don't really know anyone that's Chinese. How do you start? And I'm going to tie that in with a question from Ellen, which is, like, what immigrants do you know of that are currently residing in Elmhurst?
Yeah, so I remember sitting with a second gen Asian American church, and I'd spoken at this church. It was Queens, Long Island, somewhere, and she said, I don't even know where to start, because she says, I don't feel like I have a story to tell. And I remember feeling very sad about that, because if you really know Christ, you have a story to tell. But her whole experience in church had been that cultural thing. And so one is making sure you have such a relationship with Christ, that flows into having a heart for the nations. That's always first. The second is, what are natural ways that you can start placing yourself in super plan type moments? For instance, I can go just buy big bags of rice from BJ's, or I could go buy big bags of rice from the Pakistani halal place in my neighborhood, right? Which one is going to give me probably more of an opportunity to interact with others? Doing something I naturally do. That's not, even beyond that, most immigrants, especially from the least reached areas of the world, they've had so much dignity taken away from them and come here, and so much kind of oppression they face, and they're just fighting to survive. If you just go up to anyone pretty much and say, and however you do it, but what's your story before you want to share the gospel, but just what's your story? It's amazing. I have books and books and crazy amounts of languages in my office from people that said, no one's ever asked about Belarusians. Here's a 800-page book on that Belarusian history in New York. I'm like, I'm never going to read that. But they were just so happy that someone asked their story. And then, the best evangelists and missionaries I've ever met come across as quite dumb. They're really good question askers. So they're not there, just constantly pounding. They're asking questions that are finding out how God is at work in someone's life, and then they're able to speak into that moment and pray for that moment, and that scripture that speaks into that person's life at that point is what draws them to being interested to having a Bible study or something. And so go in and find natural ways to meet them, and there are plenty of opportunities to do that in the city. Just go buy stuff from their stores, right? And that's easy. And then while you're there, just start praying for them. We call it prayer walking. You could even just go walk. If you've never done this, go into a new neighborhood of unreached people groups, and our websites and things can guide you where that is, or peoplegroups.info, and just start walking and praying through the neighborhood. We actually host some of these. I think we've got one in September with Heart for Muslims we're going to host in the city. But just go do it yourself, and you will see the city in a new light, because you're starting to not see it through my own world, my occupation, my Chinese American world, or whatever it is, but through kind of God's larger story. So begin with prayer, and begin with God's heart for the nations, and then finding some natural ways to interact and ask questions.
So ethnic groups in Elmhurst, we have lots of Indonesians, we have tons of Tibetans, Nepalis, Indians, Chinese, obviously, Malaysians, Filipinos, Hispanics. What else would you add to the list, Chris?
Of course, right there, you've got in Jackson Heights, you've got the little Pakistan, little India, little Bangladesh, but also little Tibet, little Nepal. Probably venturing into Elmhurst, maybe still on the Jackson Heights side. There was an old church that used to house 10 congregations, church congregations, that is now a Sherpa Buddhist temple.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
That used to house as many churches. I've actually been through every single street of Elmhurst, Jackson Heights, and Flushing as part of a religious census. So I've talked to people all over there. Of course, you have the largest Thai concentration in Metro New York is there in Elmhurst. Have a beautiful temple. They actually have a place for the American husbands of Thai women to sit in that Thai Buddhist temple there in Elmhurst. Yeah, so even within those, the Nepali alone are very diverse, with indigenous groups and more Nepali Hindu groups. So, Sherpa, you might meet a cab driver who's Sherpa, but he's climbed at the top of Mount Everest, there are people like that all over Elmhurst. You mentioned a lot of the major ones. Indonesians, this is what's strange. Migration often pre-selects certain groups to come. Yeah. So it's not going to reflect the demographics often of the home country. And Indonesians and a lot of Southeast Asia, it's heavy Chinese from those countries, as opposed to the more dominant Muslim groups. But even Indonesian churches, there are dozens of Indonesian churches in New York City, and it's going to be Batak and Javanese, and it's going to be all these different types of ethnic groups. Of course, variety of Hispanic groups in the city. I know Salvadorans are around there. A lot of your South American groups, are spread throughout the city. Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are everywhere, like the Bangladeshis. Yeah. Those are some of the big ones that stick out besides what you mentioned.
Great. Yeah, so now I'll open the floor to Q&R, and so you can unmute yourself and turn on your video if you want to ask a question. And I read you had one. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or.
No, yeah. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Chris. My question is about strategic buying the bag of rice, halal store, the Pakistan store. I think those are great ideas, but then would you say to be truly effective, we really need a lifestyle shift? Would you say that that's true? Because these nice ideas, though many of us have done it, but to truly see fruit, we really need a lifestyle shift. Would you say that's true or not really?
Yeah, usually like church outreach to unreached peoples, they'll, at best, even if they do it, it'll treat it as an event. This is something we'll go do once a year. Even some of the first generation, like Arab churches are big on this. That'll be Christian background groups, and we're going to go for one time a year. We're going to go out to the Muslim neighborhood and we're going to go preach at them. And it's usually never all that effective. The word in Greek for witness, it's not a presentation. It's the word martyr. It's this idea of you lay down your life. It's sacrifice. And that is really what it takes to see breakthroughs among the least reached people groups. There are people that are making a sacrifice intentionally with the lifestyle, a missional lifestyle, that martyr witness lifestyle, so that even the bad things that happen in your life, those unreached people's groups are going to see it, and they're going to and see how you respond, as a follower of Christ. So we just had a missionary that was burglarized in Senegal, and through that, instead of just ranting and raving, they're actually missionaries in New York City, but we're in Senegal for language learning. And through that, a Muslim guy witnessed it, saw the way they responded to questions. They started having a relationship. Turns out that God had been working on this guy already. And he becomes a follower of Christ through being burglarized. That doesn't happen through events. That happens through sharing your life. And you need to, and that's why even I shared those pictures of like our baby naming ceremonies and things like that. And they said later, said, thank you so much. Like you took something that was familiar to us, but you were true to yourself and your faith in Christ, but invited us in a way that we would all feel comfortable. And that's really why we bridge the culture to them. Like, why should someone have to take the onus of discomfort on themselves to come into a Christian world to hear the gospel? You know, Christ came into a certain context and took on the discomfort of human flesh and so forth. We need to take on the discomfort ourselves to enter into their world. And so I've done things like in New York City, teaching the Bible in mosques. I've taught English classes in mosque. I've taught character and values in mosque. You know, I've held in Muslim centers, you know, ways just to help their community and through English or citizenship or whatever. Find ways to enter into their world, and it doesn't take a lot of language, culture skills to do that. Even the imam, he asked me one day when we're in the mosque, he said, do you know why we let you in here? I said, well, no, why? He said, well, everyone here knows that you're a Christian. Many of them know you're like a pastor, but you love us and you respect us, and we want you to be a part of the community. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. Most peoples in the city will welcome you in if you love and respect them and find ways to bless them.
Can I
Thank you.
jump in here?
Hey, Greg.
Hey, Chris. I just want to say that I think your statement about, well, I'm going to follow up with what Red said as well, just that strategic idea. But also, I like what you said about just making this as a part of your regular routine. And a lot of times when it comes to doing this kind of work or this kind of ministry, people do have an event orientation. And so my wife and I, one of the things that we like to do is we like to visit certain restaurants, and we repeatedly go back there. And we intentionally go to Elmhurst and Jackson Heights. And from that, we've developed relationships with the owners, and it's amazing because it wasn't, and my wife and I were never thinking, oh, let's do missions work. You know, we just went into a restaurant, and sometimes people are like, well, what do you do? Like, okay, I can go and eat there, but what you said about asking questions it's remarkable. If you just ask a question like, hey, how long have you been running this restaurant? And like, what's particular about your food? One of the things my wife and I would like to do is go in and say, okay, pretend like we're your guests, and you order the food for us and tell us why you would order it.
Sure. And
it is amazing how many people open up because, and we'd even have the hosts come and sit at our table with us and as we're eating their food and talking about it. And it was like, I don't know, it's like, it must have been a spirit-led thing because we weren't sitting there saying like, how do we be really strategic? But asking good questions. And even some of the servers, when people come over, you know, if you notice something, you can just say, hey, I remember at one restaurant we were at where it was a Korean restaurant, but the woman was blonde. And I'm like, how'd you end up here? You know, like you just don't fit it very well. And then she just went up and she started talking, and you know, she was from Bulgaria. And she said she was from the eastern side. I said, well, that means you must be Muslim then. And she stopped. She just stopped and she goes, how'd you know that? And a large conversation ensued. In fact, she was getting in trouble because she kept talking to us when she should have been waiting tables. But that kind of thing, it's just a simple couple questions, and it can really happen. And just for people who are listening, because a lot of times, Chris, going from what you've done naturally as a missionary, and you've built up these different ways of moving into different communities and things like that. For most people, like, where do I start? I think the simplest things you can do, visiting the same store, visiting the same restaurants, with people that are from different immigrant groups, and then just starting asking questions. Anyway, I loved what you said. It got me all excited. And I would just want to say that Ellen and I can attest to that simple little measures like that, opening doors.
Well, if you think about how Scripture calls us the aroma of Christ, the fragrance of Christ, and just even being physically present somewhere, smell of life to some and smell of death to others. But, if you just go and be physically present as a follower of Christ and really believe that to be true, you're going to find these people that are going to be open and welcoming, even in the places that you thought never would be. I mean, restaurant, that's pretty easy because it's great food anyways, but you would be surprised, even going into temples and mosques and things like that, how welcoming people will be and seeing something in you. So yeah, go into their space for sure.
That's beautiful. And it's just so good to hear it from more than one person. So it's not just a Chris Klayman thing, because a lot of people can often feel like, oh, that's just because it's their personality set or their gifts, whatever. Anyways, anyone else? I'd love to hear more questions. And you can chat them in as well. Chat them in, just your voice, or show your face.
So we got a question here sent to me privately. For people who want to reach their unreached neighbors but don't know how, what are specific on-ramps and ways for them to get trained and equipped to learn best practices and strategies for effectively engaging the nations around them with the gospel and making disciples? They're equipping things that multiple organizations in the city would do throughout the year. There's some on a full-time basis and some as more like an event sort of thing that you would come to. I do have, if you email me at cklayman@globalgates.info, I have a Reaching the Unreached of Metro New York Facebook page, as well as an email list where I send out some of these opportunities locally. Often get too busy and don't do it as often as I should, but things like the Heart for Muslims conference and stuff like that. Mentioned some tools that can be used, like Perspectives in the World Christian Movement, which we've done in the city. Momentum Yes, that I believe New Life is kind of going through now. That's even free, that you can do locally. But there are all sorts of missionaries that would love to come into churches and give training seminars. We do that all the time. So yeah, there's a number of things out there, including some like web trainings that can be used as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and for all the other people that have given their input and shared questions as well. Anyone else? Chris Klayman's a very busy man, considering it took me 15 years to finally see his face again. I don't know the next time you're going to have this opportunity.
Hey, Chris, this is Nate Jones in Nashville.
Hey, Nate.
Hey, thanks so much. We're wrestling with just kind of our team statements when we're asked why we're learning Somali and we're selling camel milk. What did you just embrace the identity as missionary when you guys landed in New York City, or how did you go about?
So one of the difficult things, if you keep on showing up at that restaurant all the time, and like, well, you have to be CIA, right? So sometimes, even in research of ethnic groups, you kind of have to have a short, tenable statement, and often too much talking is going to be bad for you. And so it can be as simple. You're starting off going, "Hey, I just love the diversity of the world, that God has created, and I've seen, Afghans around here a lot, and I'm really wanting to know more about them, just because I love all the people's God, whatever is that's going to be your short one." Now, if you're in your case, I know you're working with Somalis on a regular basis. I have found and I think the research around the world would back this up, those that have some sort of other platform besides a kind of religious or righteous person who helps people to find God, they find it difficult to have as much of the opportunities to be conspicuous enough for seekers to find them. And so, especially where you're not going to get kicked out of the country, you know, I just found it's better to be a religious instructor, someone who helps point people to the straight path to God. And certainly that smell of life, smell of death will become more fragrant when you even are known as that person in the community. Some people are going to totally try to shut you down, but it's also going to, what you need to be is conspicuous enough that people can find you if God starts working on them. And I just find that that's a respected position in most Muslim communities, even being and so I'd go into a mosque, for instance, and say, hey, I know that I have lots of Muslim friends that know the Quran, but it says in the Quran that the Torah, Zabur, and Injil are God's word. This is the Old and New Testament. And I said, I have hardly met any African Muslims who have studied the Torah, Zabur, and Injil, but the Quran says you'll be judged by what God has revealed in it. I said, you know, I'm not an expert on the Quran. I have read it. Many Muslims are experts on the Quran, but I have studied the Torah, Zabur, and Injil all my life, and I would be glad to study with anyone interested. And I have found that, you know, being at a point of respect for them, and even not coming at it of just trying to destroy the Quran or anything like that, they know that I am someone they can go to with questions about the Torah, Zabur, and Injil. And I find that I've even been called upon. Now, Somalis are a different bunch of people than some of these West African groups. But I've had West African Muslim groups even call on me often to pray at their meetings and things like that. Will call me their pastor sometimes. Thankfully now there's actually a Muslim background Christian from Africa that he's been able to take my place in those roles, which is much more effective than the white guy that's there. So I don't do those as much. But I think looking at the risk involved, don't think about your security. Think about what's an appropriate measure of risk. You always have to take some risk. And what's going to be the type of risk that is going to help find people that God is working on? That's the question to work through.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wow. That's a great question. It reminds me of one of my friends. His name is Richard Benson. He's a language guy out in Minnesota, and he speaks Oromo. And people will ask him, why do you speak Oromo, which is a language from Somalia? And then he'll say, well, because I live in Minnesota. Why else? And he happens to be a Christian as well, so he has that in mind. But it's something as simple as that, as just knowing a fact or a language, and people suddenly open up to you in ways you never imagined. Yeah, any more questions from people?
The relationship I had with the mosque, it actually started with me. We'd done so many good things in the community. Someone wanted us to meet the imam. We met the imam. The imam says, why did you go to Mali? Right? But it was a great opportunity. Often, or they'll ask, are you a Christian? And you can always give yes or no answers to things. But remember, if you're answering yes or no to those questions, you're answering in their interpretation of what a Christian is or what something is. It's better to show and explain. And so I said, I saw a lot of people living their life just to have nice things and to have peace, have security and comforts around me. And when I looked at the life of Isa, Al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, I saw that his whole life was about giving his life away for others, and I wanted to do the same. That was my answer to him. And because of that, he says, I want you to come back and have more conversations with me. And I ended up leading to teaching English in the mosque, just seeing an opportunity because I was there. They wanted to host an English class because I was in the environment. I said, well, I'll teach an English class. And then did that. And then the imam kind of came to me at one point and then said, okay, I want to study the Bible with you. But that didn't happen until 2 months down the road. And it just came with giving very honest answers that were spiritual in nature, that pointed to my faith in Christ as being the most important thing, but done in a respectful, that wasn't in their face.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Man, I think people are questioned out, and it's we've been at this for a little bit, but man, thank you so much, Chris, for spending time with us fighting Corona and still giving a talk. Like, so many.
I'll go crash this afternoon.
Yeah, go crash this afternoon. You earned it. Where can people get in touch with you? Follow
I don't
you
want people to get in touch with me.
through Twitter or like.
I can't answer everyone, but they can. I listed those websites in the chat. globalgates.info. For events, you can email me about reaching the unreached of Metro New York. And anytime I give an update like that, it will give different opportunities in the city with least reached peoples. I know in September, we're planning a prayer walk in unreached people group neighborhoods throughout the city that's associated with Heart for Muslims. And we'll have missionaries there that will kind of give some kind of things to pray about. That's still in planning process. Peoplegroups.info is a great one to get info on people groups in your neighborhood. Like you can take census information and it will just, I can look up Indonesians, for instance, and it'll go down and it'll shade down to a census tract level where all they live in the city. So that's on peoplegroups.info. Unreached New York has some profiles. The superplan.com, if you go there, it has info about the book, but if you go under resources, it'll say next steps ideas. And that is, it's probably 50 different ideas of what people can do to get started with some of these things we started, like going and buying at the Pakistani, going to the restaurant, prayer walking through the neighborhood. It has around 50 different ideas from under the categories of learning, welcoming, praying, going, sending, and so forth. So you can check that out under next steps ideas. And then at Chris Klayman GG is my Twitter handle. I don't do it all that much, but probably more from at Global Gates Info is our Twitter and Facebook. Yeah,
Global Gates people are active, they're alive, they're all over the place, and there are many of them you can get into contact with. Just shoot them an email. Maybe not Chris, but others. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. It was a joy to be able to make this happen. We were supposed to have him in March, but because of Corona, and now he's here. And so thank you so much for participating with all of us. Just a reminder that we are City Mission. We seek to make our neighborhood thrive. And we get there by empowering you and empowering youth, immigrants, and those experiencing homelessness. And so before we close, why don't I pray just a closing thing for Chris and for everyone at Global Gates. And God, thank you so much that you are the giver of peace, and that you are the one that we can turn to. And in this time, even though we're stuck at home and amongst other things, God, thank you that you still have given us opportunities by which to reach people, whether it be raising $23,000 for the Elmhurst Hospital and getting masks for them, or packing food for the people that need it at food pantries and everywhere else. God, there are so many opportunities to still love people and to show who you are to them. And so we give thanks for all this input from Chris. We give thanks for the people that are working with Chris and Global Gates and NAM and the Send and everyone that is involved throughout this nation, this world, all the missionaries involved and all the people that are trying to love those that are in front of their face in their neighborhood, whether it be buying rice from a Pakistani supermarket instead of the one that you usually go to, or whatever the case may be. God, help us realize that it is as easy as buying rice. It is as easy as buying coffee. It is as easy as just saying hello. God, we just pray that you would constantly put that burning desire in our hearts to create this neighborhood that you want us to see, not to pursue things for the American dream, not to pursue comfort and all those things that we think are nice and will last us forever, but for what truly lasts forever. So we just want to bless Chris and his family and all those involved as they, one, get better, and two, continue to strategize and to continue to meet with people and continue to share with people, whether it be mosques, churches, or synagogues, temples, about your love. And we thank you for all the people that have been here, participated, and shared and asked questions. And thank you for them and your blessing on them. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen.